which had been annexed to Bulgaria from Greece and Yugoslavia. However, as you see from the document itself, the line was penciled out, though in such a manner as to leave the text legible. The significance of this erasure is explained in Danneker's report to Eichmann. Bulgaria did not want to throw its Jews to the wolves. It was easier to induce the Bulgarians to hand over foreign Jews from recently annexed territories than the Jews of Bulgaria proper. Consequently, in accordance with an official decision, it was originally written that the agreement, the petition, would affect the newly acquired areas. However, as reported by Danneker, both sides were aware of the fact that 20,000 Jews were not to be found in these areas and that about 6,000 would still be lacking from the quota. And Commissar Belev undertook to supply these from Bulgaria proper. At least half would come from Sofia, wrote Danneker, and those to be taken would be influential Jews, that is to say, those whose economic position is sound or who have contacts with official Bulgarian circles. In answer to Belev's question whether he would prepare additional deputations, Danneker replied in the affirmative. An attempt to deport Jews from old Bulgaria was frustrated at the last moment as a result of intercession in Sofia. Consequently, according to the German report, the deputation embraced no more than 11,343 Jews who were transported for extermination to Poland. After the Jews of Thrace and Macedonia had been handed over for extermination, an attempt was made to avoid deporting the others. The Jews were removed to scores of forced labor camps, but the Bulgarian authorities opposed the deportation to Germany. Naturally, from the point of view of the Gestapo, this territorial concentration was the normal preparatory phase leading to the final extermination. This was why it was stated in the official report, quote, "After having expelled the Jews from Sofia, we shall certainly, according to our knowledge of the situation on the spot, be confronted with new problems until we succeed in removing them to the eastern regions. In the meantime, however, the Jewish question has substantially moved forward in the direction of the transportation to the east. Things are on the move, there is no longer a way back." Unquote. But the Bulgarians nevertheless refused to deport additional Jews. The accused then contended that the deportation of the Jews to the work camps was nothing but an excuse to, I quote, "an excuse to avoid deporting the Jews to the east, which for Germany is the desired solution." Unquote. In spite of the pressure, the Jews were left in the forced labor camps. Conditions were harsh and difficult, and many broke under the strain, but they were not handed over to the Germans. By this time, things were moving at the front, and Bulgaria sought a way to extricate herself from her ties with the Axis countries. The Jews who remained were saved. The Jews of occupied Greece also passed through the valley of the shadow of death, especially the Salonika community, where the majority of Jews in occupied Greece lived. Brutality, arrests, plunder, the loot of property accompanied the German conqueror, in addition to anti-Jewish legislation, the Jewish badge, and the establishment of ghettos. Here Eichmann operated through his accomplices Viciseni, Alois Brunner, and Berger, who worked in close association with the military government. Burton. Once again, we shall witness the result of their activities: kidnapping for forced labor, and the ally was to introduce into the Jewish quarter, typhus. Finally, in March 1943, the death deportation began in cattle and goods wagons. With all speed and energy, about 54,000 Salonika Jews were removed to the extradition camps. Eichmann issued specific instructions that the sick and the diseased were also to be deported. We shall hear a description of how these Jews went to their deaths, transport after transport, how one of the best organized communities in the world was destroyed. At the beginning of June 1943, the intellectuals' transport was deported to Salonika, and in August of the same year, the operation was brought to a close. After this, the accused continued to deal with the Jews of foreign nationality in Salonika and ensured that they be included in the final solution. Eichmann also sought to lay his hand on the handful of Jews in the Italian-occupied area, and especially in Athens. But the Italians did not cooperate. Visliceni went to Athens to hunt down the Jews and even succeeded in arresting the Saul family, the head of which was the legal advisor to the Italian legation in Greece. The Italians threatened to arrest Visliceni on their territory, and Eichmann reacted post-haste, threatening to report to Himmler. The Italians had taken it to their heads to arrest the German police officers in the pursuance of his duties. The German Foreign Office eventually explained Visliceni's journey as being occasioned by special reasons which have no connection with police operations. Eichmann naturally received a report of this explanation, but continued to complain bitterly at the lack of cooperation on the part of the Italians. We shall only be, and he wrote, quote, "We shall only be satisfied if the Italians adopt in their territories the same measures as are accustomed to adopt in our occupied territories, namely the removal of all Jews to the east."
The Holocaust also swept over other communities in Greece. The Jews of Rhodes, some of whom were removed to Auschwitz and some drowned. The Jews of Corfu, Thessaly, Epirus, the Peloponnese and the Greek islands. Now, let us take a look at those areas which the Germans considered as a part of the Greater Reich. The work in the Czech Protectorate was carried out according to the familiar pattern: anti-Jewish laws, the appropriation of property, and enclosure in ghettos. Here, too, we shall find a special Nazi invention. It is called Theresienstadt. At a meeting of SS commanders on October the 10th, 1941, in which Eichmann and Heydrich took part, the solution to the Jewish problem in the Protectorate was discussed. It was stated that in view of the Czech attitude to Jews, which differed from that current in the territory of the general government in Poland, due allowances would have to be made. According to the minutes, Eichmann suggested that 5,000 Jews be deported from Prague to communist prisoner of war camps under the command of Neb and Rush. Nebe and Rush, these two last mentioned, were then the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen which had received the order for the direct extermination of Jews. The meaning of his suggestion was clearly to send 5,000 Jews to death. He did carry out the operation, and we have already met these Jews doomed for a certain and cruel death in the Riga and Minsk ghettos. A substantial part of the remaining Jews were removed to the Theresienstadt ghetto, which was set up by Eichmann and was under his direct command. Tens of thousands of Jews were concentrated in this camp, which was intended to serve a number of purposes. Firstly, to pacify the Jews themselves in a way, since the Theresienstadt deportees were ostensibly to be granted life by the evil regime. The Jews who sought some consolation was allowed to deceive himself into believing that if he were deported to Theresienstadt, he would not be killed. Secondly, here was a kind of an official window front to satisfy all those who claimed that all the Nazis were capable of doing was to kill. Red Cross representatives and journalists could be brought to Theresienstadt, as could heads of states in the countries from which Jews had been expelled who feared for their fate. In Theresienstadt they could put on a show. It would be a place in which the Jews supposedly lived and worked under their own independent administration, and most important of all, alive. All this was only a means of deception and camouflage, since from the very outset this camp was meant to be nothing more than a pretense. The internal decision on its establishment, it was stated, and I quote, "The best thing would be the transfer of the Theresienstadt camp to the authority of the Central Authority for Jewish Migration. After the deportation from this temporary collection camp, where the Jews will soon be severely decimated, it would be possible to deport the whole crew to territories in the east and to transform the place into a model German settlement." Unquote. It was decided on the spot that Theresienstadt would have no cemetery, only a crematoria to burn the bodies. It was also stated that in the event of a shortage of living quarters for the Jews, they should dig holes and tunnels for themselves in the ground. And this became a part of the official policy of the destruction program. On the one hand, the extermination of millions, and on the other, Theresienstadt, ostensibly under its independent Jewish administration. Naturally, the administration was entirely in the hands of the Eichmann gang. From time to time, punitive measures were showered on the Theresienstadt Jews, executions as a punishment for sending post contrary to the rule, the prohibition of births, compulsory abortion for women, the prohibition of smoking, etc. The children were housed in an institution within the precincts of the ghetto and were permitted to see their parents once a week. Violators of the ghetto administration's orders were punished by beating. We shall submit to you the orders of the day of the ghetto administration, and you shall see how Eichmann held his victims under constant terror. It was necessary, however, to obtain the consent of Himmler himself to expel Theresienstadt inmates to Auschwitz or the eastern regions for extermination. Needless to say, this consent was given whenever it was asked for. The death rate in Theresienstadt was appalling, owing to the terrible conditions. Those who were not dispatched by this camp were finished off at Auschwitz. This was in actual fact a collection and transit camp for extermination. Those who passed through it were Jews of the Protectorate as well as many foreign nationals, tens of thousands of Jews from Germany, Austria, and other places. To Eichmann's crimes in the Protectorate should be added the slaughter of the Christian children of Lidice. Lidice was a Czech village which was wiped off the face of the earth in revenge for an attempt on Heydrich's life. About 100 unfortunate children from this village were removed to the lodge ghetto, Litzmannstadt, there to suffer the same fate as the Jews. Krume, one of Eichmann's assistants, asked him for instructions with regard to the application of special treatment to these children. The murder of innocents, this everywhere was Eichmann's business. and so to Austria, where once again we shall meet with the operations so familiar from elsewhere. At first, pressure was maintained to expedite the expulsions. Eichmann was even prepared to hand over Herzl's remains in Vienna, providing that these would leave together with at least 8,000 Jews. Afterwards, with a change in the general line, came the familiar operations, anti-Jewish legislation, looting, deportation to extermination areas, to the operational areas of the Einsatzgruppen and to Poland. Jewish property was confiscated and transferred to German ownership. The Jews were told that since they had not succeeded in migrating from Germany, the Germans would have to begin removing them to Poland for labor. The community institutions were ordered to supply lists of deportees. Later on, they would speak simply of removal to the general gouvernement. The Viennese Jews were transported to their deaths via Theresienstadt, Lodz, Minsk, Riga and other places. Others were consigned directly to the extermination camps in the east. All these operations were carried through by Eichmann under his direct supervision. All Jewish affairs in Austria were under his control. In Germany itself, the deportations to Poland had already begun at the beginning of 1940. The Jews of Stettin and Schneidermühl were deported, it was stated, because of the need to vacate apartments for Germans. Eichmann carried this into effect within the scope of his eviction authority. He deported the Jews from Baden and Pfalz to Vichy, France at the end of 1940. Later on, the deportation of Jews from Germany became part of the final solution. Those Jews were sent to an immediate death in Minsk and Riga, or dispatched for execution later via the large ghetto, Litzmannstadt. We shall submit to you the detailed instructions for the deportations to the extermination region in Lublin, issued by Eichmann from the beginning of 1942 to all police units, Stabsstellen, and to the commanders of the security service, the SD. May 30, 1942, Eichmann informed the representatives of the committees of Vienna, Prague, and Berlin that the Reich, Austria, and the Protectorate were to be cleansed of Jews. In Berlin, roll calls, known as Eichmann roll calls, Eichmann Appelle, took place at which the deportation selections were made. Once again, we shall see the direct hand of Adolf Eichmann, planning, executing, and tackling all matters, both small and large, relating to the final solution. Finally, in 1944, Hungary was the only country within the sphere of influence of the Reich left with a considerable Jewish population, and this was Hungary. After the annexation of southern Slovakia, northern Transylvania and Carpatho-Russia, there were about 800,000 Jews living in Hungary. Since 1942, when a representative of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs had demanded of the Hungarian ambassador to fulfill the Führer's wish and take part in the solution of the Jewish problem, there had been constant Nazi pressure on the Hungarian government to fall in line on the Jewish question. As usual, the promise was made that Jewish property would be turned over to Hungary. The objectives outlined by the Foreign Ministry to its representative in Budapest were to demand that the Hungarians remove the Jews from all influence in cultural and economic life, introduce the Jewish badge, uproot the Jews and deport them to the east. The Magyars, however, contented themselves in the first place with legislation denying the Jews a number of rights. Prime Minister Kalai did not hide his anti-Semitic feelings. He did not agree to throw the Jews to the wolves. Replying to a question from a member of the Arrow Cross Party in the Hungarian parliament, Kalai stated on December 7, 1942, that the time was not appropriate for imprisoning the Jews in labor camps and ghettos. Naturally, Eichmann received Eichmann already looking forward to the extermination of Hungarian Jewry. When the foreign ministry proposed action against Jews who miserable existence as Armenians. Harty was not convinced. At the end of 1943, Wiesenmeier, who was later to be German ambassador in Budapest, sent a final report to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, proposing that Germany should no longer rest content with the fact that independent Hungary was her ally, but should actually occupy the country. One of the declared purposes of the occupation was to harness Hungary to the program of exterminating the Jews. And the thing was done. When Harty was invited a second time to meet Hitler on March 17, 1944, an ultimatum was presented to him. And while he was still debating what to do, the German army crossed the border and took control of the whole country without resistance. With the entry of Germans, Eichmann and his special unit moved in. The of Hungarian Jewry had been sealed. Eichmann brought into Hungary his whole group of accomplices, the entire gang of murderers who together with him had carried out the extermination program in the various conquered lands. Therefore, the top echelons of the IVB-4 were assembled after being released from their duties in other countries where the extermination program had been completed or was continuing without them. Here then was an apparent sense of urgency in all their activities, a desire to finish the job at all costs, and need to concentrate all stages of the preparatory work, at times to skip some of them, to shorten procedures, with the sole purpose of achieving results as quickly as possible. The gang had at their disposal all the power of the German army as well as the Hungarian civil service. When Stoyai, a puppet of the Germans, was appointed prime minister. It is doubtful whether the Nazis any longer believed at that time that they could win the war, but they wanted at least to complete the destruction of the Jews. On this front, come what may, they wanted to guarantee themselves a victory. Arch himself took his place at the head of this group, controlling the dirty work in the field. Here he appears not only as the one who pulls the strings, directs, plans, stimulates, and is generally responsible for implementation, but also as an independent executive officer. Himmler had laid down that Eichmann was his plenipotentiary, according to the evidence given by Vajda Gábor, the Hungarian Minister of the Interior. His faithful colleague was Andrei, the Hungarian Secretary of State for Jewish Affairs. The lesson of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt had been well learned. Eichmann was determined that this disgraceful episode would never be repeated. Particular attention was devoted to ensuring that it would never occur to the Jews to revolt or attempt to escape and save their property. The Nazi aim was to murder and to inherit at one and the same time. The anti-familiar program of oppression was put into action here at one fell swoop, accompanied as usual by inducements and the raising of false hopes. Expectations of rescue were raised while the property was being plundered, consideration was shown in trivial matters, and the illusion was spread that no harm would come to those Jews who were ready to work. But in the meantime, all the necessary preparations were being made in the death camps, which had already actually ceased operations. Rudolf Hess was ordered to set Auschwitz in motion again and to make all preparations for intensified extermination. And he arrived in Budapest to coordinate arrangements with Eichmann. Eichmann insisted on an intake of frequent transport, but Hess contended that he would be unable to handle such large numbers. Finally, they compromised. 2 trains one day and 3 the next. And indeed, Auschwitz had never witnessed a period of such feverish activity as in the summer and autumn of 1944. The gas chambers and furnaces worked day and night. Matters reached such a pitch that bodies were burned in the open field. There were times when in one sweep more than 10,000 Jews a day were destroyed. The extermination process in Hungary began in earnest on the morrow of the occupation. Already on March 20, 1944, Wyslizenie and Krumme, Eichmann's principal that time on, the flood of the all-too-familiar laws and decrees was let loose. The prohibition to leave one's place of residence, the prohibition to use transport, the disconnection of telephones, the freezing of bank accounts, house curfews, the closure of shops, registration of all property, and the like. When the community representatives lodged complaints, the accused retorted that all orders must be carried out without delay. At the beginning of April, all Hungarian Jews from 6 years of age and over were obliged to wear the yellow badge. An air attack on Budapest provided the command with a pretext to commandeer 500 Jewish apartments, which were turned over, complete with furnishings and equipment to Hungarians. And while the Jewish representatives were seeking to mitigate the decree, the number of apartments demanded was raised to 2,000. Jews were hunted on trains and in the streets. Those taken were assembled in camps, the most infamous of which was the Kistad camp. A roundup of Jews was started in the provincial towns, according to prepared zones marked out in advance. In a number of towns, ghettos were set up where conditions were so wretched that they defy description. To carry out the roundout in Budapest in one sweep was no easy task, as its 250,000 Jews were scattered throughout the city. It was thus found necessary to operate in stages, the houses in which Jews were ordered to live being marked with a large yellow sign. Here too, Hungarians and Jews were informed that the Jews were only wanted for work. The Hungarian government agreed to put 50,000 Jews at the disposal of the Reich for work in Germany. But the official German correspondence, all in the name of the accused, clearly indicates the true objective: Auschwitz.
The mass deportations began in the middle of May 1944. Reports exist on the different stages of the operations, the details of which were worked out by Eichmann. While negotiations marked by extortions and promises of rescue were in progress, a daily average of 12,000 were being deported. Wislizeny contacted Pinchas Freudiger, a leader of the Orthodox community, whose grandfather had been the recipient of an Austrian title of nobility and who was consequently addressed as Baron Freudiger. In return for $2 million, Wislizeny offered to rescue Jews and even received a substantial payment on account. Parallel negotiations interspersed with threats of extermination and promises of rescue were in progress between Eichmann, Kastner and Joel Brandt. Kastner was the representative of the Jewish Rescue Committee, and it was Brandt who was chosen as the emissary to bring Germany's fantastic offer, blood for goods, to the Western world. Jews were to be saved in return for trucks, coffee, tea and soap. The Jews were told that the trucks would not be used on the Western Front. Brandt, accompanied by Bandy Gross on Eichmann's orders, was instructed to travel to neutral Turkey to submit the offer to Jewish bodies. Another motive on the part of the Germans was revealed in an official report sent by Ambassador Wesenmeyer to Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister. Ribbentrop, on hearing of the suggested deal over the London radio, requested his ambassador to full details immediately. The latter reported that because of the shortage of certain commodities, Brandt had been dispatched with an offer that in return for these goods, in quotes, a number of Jews would be allowed to leave for Turkey, unquote. According to Ribbentrop's testimony at the Nuremberg trial, the foreign minister promptly intervened to cancel the deal, since it would be beneath German dignity to receive payment in return for stopping the extermination. Kurt Becher, a high-ranking SS officer, was delegated by Himmler to conduct these negotiations, and his aim was to extort as much as possible from the Hungarian Jewish community. Himmler told Becher that he could promise what he liked. What we shall carry out, however, is a different matter. In order to facilitate the negotiations, however, Becher obtained Himmler's to allow one train containing 1,684 people to leave. The train was directed to Bergen-Belsen, and from there on 2 separate occasions those released were permitted to travel to Switzerland. The Nazis extorted $1,000 from everyone traveling on the train. When explaining the release of the second batch from Bergen-Belsen for Switzerland, Schellenberg, a high-ranking SS officer, explained that Himmler had something else entirely in mind in allowing these people to be rescued. Himmler, he said, wanted to earn himself a good name in the Western press, to assume the role of a terminator of the murders, the redeeming angel with whom it would be proper to establish contact with a view to a ceasefire armistice. It is known that Himmler did have some such scheme in mind, having already despaired of the possibility of victory on the battlefield, and believing that Hitler would be unacceptable to the Western powers as a party to the negotiations. Consequently, Himmler wanted to groom himself for such talks. And a few months later, he repeated the attempt and was on the verge of establishing contacts with the West. The premature publication of the matter over the London radio, however, naturally thwarted the whole attempt, which was, among other things, preconceived. The main target of his venom was a young Swedish diplomat, Raoul Wallenberg, an architect by profession and a man of sterling qualities, who had made the rescue of Jews his life's vocation. Wallenberg gathered around him a whole team of workers, issued passports granting the holders right of residence in Sweden, and at the risk of his diplomatic status and even his life, instituted rescue operations. He rented and acquired buildings in which he housed Jews under the protection of the Swedish flag and assembled at one period as many as 40,000 Jews. When the death march, of which I shall speak later, began, Wallenberg escorted the marchers with trucks laden with food, medical supplies and clothing. He also tried to remove from the march anyone to whom Swedish papers of protection could feasibly be issued. Wallenberg, to whose credit can be counted tens of thousands of survivors, also enrolled the support of other diplomats, as well as the Red Cross. All this was the work of one courageous man who had the strength to act according to his conceptions and belief. His deeds, like those of King Christian of Denmark, again give rise to the somber thought: how many could have been saved, even in the countries of actual extermination, had there only been many others like him among those who had the power to act, whether openly or in secret. It is not surprising that Eichmann released a flood of anger against this liberator. The Swedish embassy in Berlin lodged a complaint that Eichmann had told the Red Cross in Budapest he had in mind to shoot the Jewish dog Wallenberg. The Foreign Ministry apologized to the ambassador, stating that no doubt the words were not seriously meant. In the exchange it was explained that Eichmann's reaction had to be understood against the background of Wallenberg's illegal activities to rescue a Hungarian Jewry, and were meant to restrain him from persisting in his efforts. The deportations were carried out in secret. Nothing was mentioned about them in the newspapers, and the Germans took special measures to avoid publicity, lest the Jews of Budapest should become alarmed. The deportees on arrival at Auschwitz were ordered to send soothing postcards to their relatives. The text of the postcards was dictated by the Auschwitz butchers, who instructed that an Austrian resort, Waldsee, be designated as the place of dispatch. Postcards stated that those transported for work were all well. They usually arrived after their senders had been consumed in the Auschwitz furnaces. In response to a Red Cross request that a representative accompany the transport, Eichmann did not object to one being present during the dispatch, though only after the transport had been prepared by Eichmann. But the accompaniment of the transport, he said, by a representative must on no account be allowed. Meanwhile, the German position at the front deteriorated as the Soviet army advance continued. Pressure was put on Horthy from different quarters to put an end to the deportations, and at the beginning of July he mustered up courage and ordered that they should cease. According to an official report of their foreign ministry, the Germans had succeeded up to the end of June in sending to extermination 437,402 Jews. Horthy's instructions frustrated the plans prepared for the middle of July 1944 to deport all the Jews of Budapest on one day by mobilizing all available manpower, including even municipal workers and postmen. The details of the plan were drawn up together with Eichmann. The Germans looked for a convenient excuse for this lightning operation, and the director of the Foreign Ministry press office suggested that explosives be discovered in synagogues. Weisenmeyer rejected the suggestion on the grounds that the synagogues had for a long time been under the strict supervision of the police, and therefore the excuse would not hold water.
In spite of Horthy's order, Eichmann tried to continue the deportations. At the beginning of July, he attempted to dispatch an extermination transport from the Kistarcha camp. The matter became known to the Budapest Jewish leaders, who intervened with Horthy, who ordered that the transport be stopped at the border and sent back. When the accused saw what had happened, his lieutenants convened the whole of the community council a second time, ostensibly for discussions, and kept them occupied the whole day with inconsequential matters simply in order to detain them, while his agents in Kistarcha loaded 1,200 Jews into a deportation train and sent it on its way. The Jewish leader, virtually the prisoners of Eichmann stewards in Schwabenberg, foreboded evil. When evening came and they were released, they heard about the train and hastened to Horthy to countermand the decree again. On this occasion, however, it was too late. The train had crossed the Hungarian border, and as has now been ascertained, the community representatives were only released after the receipt of a message from Eichmann's unit that the train was safely on its way to death. And when Wislitzeny afterwards met Freudiger, he told him, "Did you really think that Eichmann will allow the old fool Horthy to frustrate his wishes?" This operation, too, proves Eichmann's satanic initiative. No one at the time demanded that he act, Horthy did not agree to the continuation of the deportations. He pointed an accusing finger at Eichmann had he refrained from action and awaited the results of the diplomatic and military pressures applied by the Germans to Hungary to renew the extermination. But when the issue at stake was the extermination of the Jews, Eichmann acted over and above any instructions. 2 letters and a postcard from Jacob Reich, who was in the 2 Kistarecha transports, have been preserved. He wrote a letter from the camp on toilet paper after having been miraculously saved in the first transport. On being deported a second time, he wrote a postcard, which it seems he threw from the train, and on which was scribbled, "Blessed be the hand that sends this postcard." Such a hand was found, and the postcard was delivered to his wife in Budapest. This is what it said, I quote, "It is Wednesday afternoon. They have packed us in, and we are traveling. God be with you, my dear family. God be with you. I embrace you, and many kisses, Father." Reich was not privileged to see his family again. His widow will submit to you his letter and postcard. The German pressure to renew the deportations did not cease. Hitler himself intervened and ordered his foreign minister to warn Horthy that Germany would not suffer any delay in measures against the Jews, and that Horthy's attitude would bring a catastrophe on the Hungarian people. To frustrate any possibility of the Jews leaving Hungary for neutral countries, Eichmann took steps, reported by Wassenmeier in the following terms to the Foreign Ministry on July 25, 1945, and I quote, "It has been agreed with Eichmann that when the deportations of the Budapest Jews becomes possible, these should be carried out with the utmost dispatch, so that the Jews who come into question for migration be deported before they have time for any formalities," unquote. Austria at that time was in urgent need of workers for fortification work. The German war plan expected heavy defensive battles to be fought in this region. At the beginning of June 1944, Blaschke, the mayor of Vienna, approached his friend, the head of the RSHA, Kaltenbrüder, with a request to consign a number of deportation transports to carry out this fortification work. Kaltenbrunner replied that instructions had been given to move about 12,000 deportees to Vienna, and they were to be kept in closed camps. The women, children, and those incapable of work would be taken for special operations. That is extermination. However, the representatives of Hungarian Jewry were informed by Eichmann and his accomplices the Jews could be saved by consignment to Austria in return for ransom money. Anyone paying as demanded would be saved by traveling to Austria. Eichmann said that he would be prepared to keep on ice, his own expression, in Austria, 30,000 Jews capable of work. The families would live in camps at the expense of the Budapest Jews. In return, he demanded a ransom of 5 million Swiss francs, equivalent of $200 per head. Some 15,000 Jews were apparently consigned to Austria in this way. In the autumn of 1944, Horthy attempted to withdraw his country from the war on the side of Germany. But the Germans, who knew of his activities, took control of Budapest by force in Operation Iron Fist. Arrow Cross arrested Horthy and on October 15 put Shalazi, the leader of the Arrow Cross, in power. Now once again were the Jews at their mercy. Eichmann, who had left Budapest when the deportations had ceased on Horthy's instructions, returned on October 18, and the operations against the Jews were renewed with full vigor. And now, with the infamous operation known as the Death March, came the finale of Eichmann's campaign of murder. There were no longer any trains available. Himmler had in the meantime ordered all exterminations to be stopped. But Eichmann found a way to circumvent Himmler's instructions. He organized, with the help of his Hungarian fascist allies, a march of Jews in the direction of Austria, ostensibly to provide labor for fortifications, but actually to murder them. Eichmann's calculation was simple. The weak would fall by the way. The sturdy would arrive at the destination to build the fortifications and would afterwards be destroyed. The march began in November. In rain, snow and cold along a 200-kilometer route. They lodged in the open or in pigsties. Thus were the women, children and old folk deported. Anyone who found the walking difficult was shot by the guard, who beat and tormented the victims every step of the way. Those who had no strength left collapsed and died. Hundreds committed suicide or died of the typhus raging among the marchers. The food allocated once every few days consisted of hot water and some bread. People died like flies. The whole route was strewn with corpses. The number of those who fell by the way is estimated at 6,000 to 10,000. The horrors attained such proportions that even the Hungarian officers and soldiers began to mutiny and requested that they be sent to the front. The intervention of Shalazi, the Hungarian Prime Minister, put an end to the march, had no effect. And then an astonishing thing occurred. Himmler himself reprimanded Eichmann for organizing this operation. And only then did the dreadful march end. The Soviet army had by this time surrounded Budapest, and the remnants of the Jewish community in the capital were saved. We shall adjourn. 20 minutes break.
I tell you, this is terrible.